Hey friends, this is Michael Bohm with Youth Apologetics Training. Today we're going to continue on with this series with Ian Juby of Genesis Week. We're talking about the evidence for a global flood. And yesterday we ended off by talking about planation. And again, that is where we have all these places around the planet where things have been planed off, as in they're just flat. You have mountain ranges, like what Ian Juby brought up yesterday towards the end of the show, talked about a 600-mile stretch in eastern Canada where the mountains were all planed off at the same height as far as the eye could see. This is 1,500 feet above sea level, and it's a 600-mile stretch of mountains, all of them planed off at the same height. How does that happen? Guys, how does that happen? Well, it happens from a flood, a big flood. And so, with that, let's pick up where we left off yesterday with Ian Juby of Genesis Week talking about evidence for a global flood.
So if you can picture that, well, if you've got a tidal wave moving at 30, 40 miles an hour minimum, that's 900 or 600 miles wide, cutting off, moving so fast that it's cutting the tops off mountains. Well, what do you have? You have a worldwide flood. Oh. But it gets better than that. When you head out to the west coast, out here in right on the border of Alberta and Saskatchewan in Canada, and portions down in Montana as well, there's the Cypress Hills Interprovincial Park. And again, these are smaller mountains that have been cut off flat at the top. But the thing is, there's a clue as to just how fast that water was moving. The mountains are covered in these rounded rocks, rounded boulders, and they're made of a rock called quartzite, which is extremely hard. And it's basically sand that has been compressed through extreme heat and pressure into rock again. And they're very tough rock. And so these rocks were rounded, broken apart, and rounded into boulders by moving water. But if you look closely at the rocks, they're covered in hammer marks. And that is from the water actually moving so fast, it was picking these boulders up and hammering them against each other. Now, Many of these boulders, you need to understand, are like 20, 30 pounds. So think about how fast that water has to be moving to be able to pick up a rock, 30 pounds. To pick it up and actually hammer it against other rocks. So Michael Ord and Peter Klevberg actually did the math. We actually have charts, geological charts that geologists use to calculate the speed of water depending on the size of rock that they're picking up. Well, this is so far off the scale they had to extrapolate. The chart just doesn't go that high. But they were able to pinpoint it down to about 70 to 75 miles an hour minimum.
Wow. And I was reading about that, and that was just rocks, these quartzites, that were about 6 inches across.
Yeah, no, there's others that are much larger than that.
But yeah, exactly. Yeah. And that's just, that's minimum.
Yes. So that's a minimum speed. And here's the thing. Those rocks did not come from Alberta and Saskatchewan. They came, we can tell the direction the rocks came from because if you can picture it, as the water is slowing down, the bigger rocks will drop out first because they're heavier. And the water can still be moving fast enough to carry smaller rocks. And so if you can picture it, you stand on the smallest rocks, face the direction of the biggest rocks, and you now can tell the direction from which these rocks came from. Can you picture that?
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
So when we face that direction, that's towards Idaho. Well, now you start walking and look for the nearest outcrop of quartzite. Where did that come from? Well, the nearest outcrop in that direction we could find is 800 kilometers away, which is about 500 miles in Idaho.
Wow.
So these rocks were picked up in Idaho by water traveling a minimum of 70 to 75 miles an hour, transporting those rocks all the way to Alberta and Saskatchewan, cutting the tops off mountains, leaving behind these rocks with hammer marks all over them, and that mountain is now about 1,500 feet above sea level. So what does that all mean? Well, it all means a global flood. A global flood, a worldwide scale flood, is the only thing that can do that. Because if you have a tidal wave of water, we all saw what happened in Indonesia and Japan. And that was, those tidal waves were nothing. Those tidal waves were moving maybe 15 miles an hour. Maybe.
Man.
Those tidal waves were 30 feet high. So these tidal waves we're talking about were 1,500 feet above sea level minimum, moving a minimum of 70 to 75 miles an hour at high elevation. Well, that's a worldwide flood. There's no getting around it. That is the only explanation. I have yet to hear the evolutionists come up with an explanation for any of this.
Wow. Okay, let me pop this one on you.
Mm-hmm.
And we didn't talk about this at all, but on one of my recent family vacations, one of our epic adventures, we passed through Utah and we went to Arches.
Oh, yes.
Is that explainable in a flood model?
Yes and no. Basically, it's, I think both the evolutionists and creationists would agree on how those arches were formed.
Okay.
But in order to get the arches, you have to have some pretty serious erosion that removes an awful lot of dirt. Because you wind up with all these buttes, right? These outcrops of rock, vertical rock. Well, that's massive erosion that I would say could only be explained with the runoff from the worldwide flood. The arches themselves probably happened, since the time of Noah's flood, and that's just from the fracturing of the rock, basically, within the buttes themselves. So I think we would both agree. The old earthers might say it took longer than we would say, but I don't think even they would argue too much with them only being a few thousand years old. And there's also an issue of rock hardness, because right after the flood, the rock would have been a lot softer because it was just formed, right? So it would have been a lot softer and much more easily eroded, therefore the arches would form more quickly. Now, that erosion, massive erosion, is something a lot of people don't think about when they think about the worldwide flood. That is just as important as the water coming onto the land. The water leaving the land was just as important, because the water leaving the land is what would have carved things like Grand Canyon. And so whether it was a post-flood lake or whether it was the actual water leaving the land, I don't know. We had a huge debate about that and really never came to a conclusion. But in either case, it takes an awful lot of water. If you go to Grand Canyon National Park, they'll tell you the mighty Colorado carved out this canyon. Well, hogwash. There's so many problems with that, it's dizzying to know where to begin. And you can actually see this depending on where you are in Grand Canyon area. The Grand Canyon cuts through what we call the Colorado Uplift. And it's a giant dome uplift. So it's exactly what it sounds like. It's a giant mountain in the shape of a dome. And the canyon cuts right through the middle of this dome. Well, wait a minute. If it's a dome, that means the water can go around the dome. Instead, the water went through the middle of the dome. Why is that? And there's a lot of speculation as to why, but the bottom line is Grand Canyon is what we call a water gap. The water cut through a mountain when it could have gone around the mountain. And again, this is unexplainable in terms of deep time. Those who adhere to deep time have to use things like the Colorado River. Well, then how did you get the Colorado to flow uphill for 3,000 vertical feet for it to start carving Grand Canyon? It can't be done. Now, in the context of a worldwide flood, there is no problem because the water started above the mountains anyway.
Now, don't they say that the Colorado River was there first? What do they call that? An antecedent stream?
Yeah, there's a couple. Yeah, and there's problems with that.
And then the land kind of rose up around it or something like that?
Yeah, and there's problems with that too. And again, that comes back to evolutionary timing. Even the evolutionists themselves disagree with that model. And,
interesting.
And it has to do with timing because the rock layers themselves, for example, have been given ages, evolutionary ages. And not just those rock layers, but you got to remember there's been thousands of feet of rock layers that have been removed from on top of the dome uplift. And you see those in the Grand Staircase, for example. So if you take a look at, if you look up Grand Staircase on Wikipedia, you can see a beautiful cross-sectional geological diagram, and you can see what I'm talking about. You have Grand Canyon, then the surface limestone there, which you drive on for, 50, 60 miles to get there. And then on top of that, as you get towards the Grand Staircase area, you get all these other layers of rock that were eroded away from on top. So you've got thousands of feet on top of that. All that has to be taken into account as well. So you can't just have some antecedent stream, because all of this rose at the same time, then was all eroded after that. There's a much bigger picture involved there, is what I'm getting at. But with these... Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. Oh, I was just I think you were finishing a thought. I'll let you go ahead.
Okay. Well, with Grand Canyon is only one example. These, what we call water gaps, we find hundreds of them around the world. Hundreds of them. Classic example, Rattlesnake Mountains in Wyoming as well. That's a beautiful example, because you can stand behind the mountain, and here's this really narrow gorge, this canyon that's been cut through this mountain that's thousands of feet deep, and they actually built a hydroelectric dam there. When they built that dam, when you're standing behind the dam of the artificial man-made lake, and you look to the right of the mountain, there's no mountain. It's open plains. They actually had to build a cofferdam on the other side of the mountain because the water would go around the mountain. And so this is another example. This is one of only hundreds you'll find of where the water chose to go through the mountain instead of around it. Now, in the idea of a worldwide flood, if that water is leaving the land, it's moving in one direction. And if a mountain rises up in front of that water is not going to stop because a mountain's rising up in front of it. It's going to cut right through the mountain. That's what the water's going to do. So within the context of a worldwide flood, it all makes complete sense. Within the context of deep time, they cannot explain it. They try and say that it was a fracture in the rock, for instance. But yet, they'll go and map out fractures in the rocks, and there aren't any that line up with the canyon. So they contradict themselves, and they can't explain it.
Interesting. Okay. Back to Grand Canyon, if the Colorado River carved that out, where is all the sediment?
Yeah, and that's a good question as well. Now, they'll tell you it's, throughout parts of Arizona, California, or all this whole, what would be the southwestern region, sort of off that end. But actually, if I recall, I even brought that up in a debate with a University of Arizona professor, and that was sort of his response was it's all over the place, and we could find it. Yes and no. I think many of us would agree that it is there. But again, even that fan, if you will, the alluvial fan from the Grand Canyon, leads to the conclusion that it was one gigantic catastrophe.
Right.
It is, because it's a huge alluvial fan. This wasn't just some, millions of years of erosion. This was a pretty big fan.
All right, I'm going to stop right there. Okay, I'm a little bit short of 15 minutes, but looking ahead at what we're going to continue talking about, it's going to be hard to stop at anywhere around 15 if I keep going. We're going to be changing subjects pretty quick here, and it's going to go for quite a ways. So I'll stop right there. Friends, if you like this content, I urge you to share it in whatever social media platforms you're using. Let's get this message out, guys. And with that, I love you guys, and I'll see you tomorrow.